Everyone, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Heather Hopkins, and I am the Research Support Specialist here at Strong Coasts. And Strong Coasts is a community-engaged graduate training and research program on systems thinking to better manage complex and interconnected food, energy, and water systems in coastal areas. We currently have a cohort of 18 fellows and faculty members at both the University of South Florida and the University of the Virgin Islands. They are in the disciplines of environmental engineering, anthropology, and marine and environmental science. So we are very excited to launch our fall webinar series today. If you have a question for the speaker today, who will be introduced shortly, most can see the Q&A button, and you can just press that and enter your question. If you don't see the Q&A, you may use the chat. We'll be fielding those questions and hopefully be able to get to all of them. And so now I would like to hand the mic over to Allison Holyvold. She is one of our fellows at the UVI campus, and she will be making introductions for us. Thank you so much, and the mic is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to today's Strong Coast Engage meeting, where we will explore food equity and science communication tactics with Dr. Joe Bozeman III. Dr. Bozeman received his PhD from the University of Illinois and is currently the chair of the Gordon Research Seminar in Industrial Ecology. Dr. Bozeman's research explores the food-energy-water nexus through the lens of climate change and social identity, with the intent to engender more effective global policy measures. This year, Dr. Bozeman and his co-authors received the AEESP Mary Ann Leiber Award for Publication Excellence in Environmental Engineering Science. The awarded 2019 article examined food consumption impacts across 3 demographics and found that despite spending less than white households on food, Black and Latinx households have greater impact on the environment per dollar spent. Let us welcome Dr. Bozeman and give him our undivided attention as we explore food equity and science communication. Dr. Bozeman, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Allison. Can you hear me all right? Well, I really want to appreciate Heather, Allison, Maya, and the entire Strong Coast crew for inviting me. And I just want to say hello to the Strong Coast Fellows. And we're going to dive right into this. I think we have some interesting things to talk about, and hopefully you'll have some engaging questions to ask. One of the things that I like to start these conversations with is creating some context at a global scale. And food production in the food system is arguably the most significant driver of global environmental change and global environmental degradation. Now, as engineers, we often pay attention to systems, ecosystems, at the molecular level, sometimes ecological level. Even when we look at it from a micro level, we sometimes lose the fact that humans are driving these engineering systems and problems, and often is going to take understanding the way humans engage with these systems to develop great solutions and policy prescriptions. So if you look at this graph we have here, it is a global urbanization trend. Some of you may have seen it, especially if you are really looking at global dynamics. But on your y-axis, you have the percentage of urbanized population. And then on your x-axis, you have years ranging from 1950 to the year 2050. Now, North America has the highest urbanized population in comparison to the other regions of the world, as most of you may intuitively expect. But there are some other regions that you may not intuitively think are rising and catching up with the North American region. And that is Asia and Africa, as you can see in the purple and dark brown lines there. And another one that a lot of folks fail to realize is that the European and Latin American and the Caribbean regions are also increasing in urbanized population. Now, the reason why this is important is because as we see more and more people cluster into smaller areas, you're going to have very interesting social dynamics emerge in ways that we've never really experienced before, with the population expected to reach somewhere close to 10 billion by year 2050. And that phenomenon, the combination of an increased urbanized population, in addition to more folks within smaller square areas in regards to meters squared or footage squared, I call this phenomenon social densification, and that is essentially the framework that has facilitated some of the research findings you'll see here in a second. Now that's our broad context. This is the the session flow for this talk. We're looking at socioeconomic data. So we're going to talk about that study that we were able to win the award for. We'll have a poll and a brainstorm session, short one. And then we'll talk about science communication tactics. And I'm really excited about the latter part. So we can really engage on how to develop and communicate these kinds of findings in effective ways. And then of course, Q&A. So let's get to the research. We'll start off with a research question and then move into the methodology and then get to our results. So the central research question for this socioeconomic study on food is, how do food consumption and spending correlate with food, energy, water impacts in the US across race and ethnic subgroups? Now, that's a big question once you start digging into it. So I think it's important to highlight the methods here. We identified land, greenhouse gas, and water as the food, energy, water impacts we wanted to measure and quantify. And we used life cycle assessment and statistical analysis of public surveys as our approach and on our technical approach. Before I dive further into the methods, I think it's important to highlight that on your top left corner, you see this picture of a farm that represents land, and land disturbance has a way of upending ecological systems that can create public health outcomes negative. And in fact, there are some theories that say the COVID pandemic was in part started due to land disturbance. And in the middle, you see a picture of carbon dioxide. That's important because the greenhouse gas emission units are in carbon dioxide equivalents. And of course, poor air quality can lead to respiratory issues as well as a host of other human health issues. And then on your right side, you have water. I think that's probably the most intuitive one, where you drink bad water, we simply don't live as humans. But nonetheless, these issues we'll be talking about have direct human health impacts. I think that's important to highlight when we're making this argument outside of the engineering population. This is our food life cycle framework. On your left side, you see these dotted lines creating a study boundary that we like to identify as the cradle to farm gate framework. This production and processing stage, which is identified and denoted as 1.1, is where the land, greenhouse gas, water quantifications are bounded by, as in these are only cradle to farm gate calculations. We do not include things like food distribution and market dynamics into our calculations. So please keep that in mind. This is only representing part of the food life cycle. And then the ecosystem functions and impacts are essentially another way of calling land, greenhouse gas, and water dynamics. On the right side, we have another study boundary that represents the actual food consumed by humans. This is where humans come into play more directly, and that is represented by preparation and consumption, life cycle stage 2.2. And the economic, societal, and health impacts is represented through our socioeconomic data that you'll see here in a second. Now, I want to highlight the economic dynamic is more directly quantified. The societal and health impacts are more so indirectly assessed from a qualitative standpoint. This is a nice visual representation of our method. I like to do things like this if I can, just to make things a little more palatable instead of giving you just the equation. But this, on your right side, this orangish cradle to farm gate few impacts for basic food items is the land, greenhouse gas, and water dynamics that you'll see represented for all basic food items. And we're talking about your basic food groups, vegetables, grains, proteins, things like that are going to be represented and quantified here. And we're going to skip some steps, but just know that the expanse of food consumed in the US is represented in this specific item. And in the middle, in the yellow, we have food consumption impacts of socioeconomic status food groups. And that's what SES stands for in this case, across the demographics. And then we also have food spending for the SES food groups across demographics. And when we apply all of that into this modular principal equation, with the X of N on the right side of this equation representing amount of food consumed at a grams per day clip, times that food consumption impact divided by the amount of dollars it costs per food group. And that is our framework for our calculations. And keep this in mind as we look through these findings. So at the US level, we find that when we use that equation and apply it to all of these different data points, and we can get into where we got those from in the Q&A if you'd like, but when we look at these data points at a mean level per household, we find that protein food group has the highest land food consumption impact rate, which is represented by the FCI $sign. Now, on your y-axis, you see that the units are square meters per dollar spent, or USD, which stands for United States dollars. And on your x-axis, you have your grains, protein, dairy, fruits, and vegetable food groups. And you'll see that consistently throughout these results. But nonetheless, protein raises to the top when it comes to how much land is disturbed per dollar spent. Let's look at greenhouse gas for a moment. Well, we find that the dairy food group has the highest greenhouse gas emissions per dollar spent. Now, this is in units of kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents for folks who really enjoy understanding the units of these kinds of things, with protein as a second. In the water category, we see that grains, and this might be a bit more intuitive, rises to the top when it comes to the amount of liters used per dollar spent at roughly 1,200 liters per USD. Now, these data points are somewhat interesting. I think it's important on this slide, I highlight that in the land, greenhouse gas, and water categories, we see a different food group emerge as having the highest impact. But to be honest, these data points, albeit novel, they're not really interesting when it comes to a human level, in my opinion. So what we did is we looked at these kinds of data points and broke it down by race and ethnicity. We looked at the Black, Latinx, and white race and ethnic subgroups, which represents over 90% of the US population, and broke these data sets down and compared them between demographics to have a better understanding of food behavior, so we can then develop policy and structure around it. Now, we had to exclude demographic and ethnic groups such as Native American, Asian, and Pacific Islander populations, simply due to the fact that the data wasn't refined enough for those race and ethnic subgroups. We hope to be able to get some significant data for them at some point in the future. Now, hopefully I've gave a bit of framework about some results, also our methods. So I want you to engage in this poll and answer this question. If you read the flyer, you might know the answer to this already, but for those that may not, we can have a little bit of fun with this poll. And Heather, if you get a chance to spring it up if we're ready for that. Ooh, even I can participate. So hopefully you're on your toes. And Heather, when you get a chance, show the poll results once we get, I don't know, to about 15 plus people in participation.
Sure, we have about 18 out of 24 right now.
Oh, nice.
Oh, it's going up. It's actually, I think we're gonna get everyone. 21.
This will be fun.
Yep, I think that's it. Okay. I will end the polling now and share the results.
All right. So based on everyone's results, it looks like we have the white population as probably taking the cake when it comes to having the highest food consumption impact rates. Now, in another framework, that would be true. However, when we look at the results, we find something very interesting. Now, I'll explain this chart on the land one, and then you'll see the same style of chart for greenhouse gas and water. But on your y-axis, you still have the same square meters per USD and respective units going forward. But on your x-axis, there's a little bit difference here. We compare the Black, Latinx, and white subgroups directly. So the darker colors represent Black, mid-tone colors represent Latinx, and white represents the lighter tone colors. But we aggregate all of these food consumption impact rates, which is represented in the top right pie chart. And I know I'm moving through this fast, but just know that the Latinx numbers that you see at the aggregate level represents the overall food consumption impact rate within each land greenhouse gas and water category. But we find that in the land category, the Latinx demographic actually has the highest food consumption impact rate in land at roughly 8 meters squared per USD. And we again see the Latinx subgroup raised to the top at roughly 5 in greenhouse gas emissions. And then we also see it here in the water category at roughly 2,200 liters per USD. Now, this may come off as counterintuitive, and I'll be honest with you, when I first saw these results, it didn't seem to make sense because I know because of other studies I've published that the white demographic tends to impact land greenhouse gas and water aggregately more than many of their demographic counterparts. But how could these food consumption impact rates emerge as the Latinx being the lead? And these things just don't seem to match up well. Well, let's look at this expenditure analysis, which is also a part of the same study. On your left side, you see a percent expensed on your y-axis. And on your x-axis, you see expensed for all food. And essentially what this bar graph is showing is that the Latin subgroup tends to spend more of its overall income on food than any other demographic we study. Moving to your right side, we have overall income. And it's important to note that the white subgroup makes the most money before and after taxes. This will be important coming up in this next slide. Now, if we were in person, I would do an imaginary line down the room and say, hey, on your left side, you have folks who make more money, and on your right side, you have folks who make less money. And generally speaking, if we had those categories established, the white households fall on the left side, which tends to have more money overall, but have the least amount of food consumption impact per dollar rates. And on your right side, you have the Latinx and Black households, which make less money overall, but have a higher food consumption impact rate. So what does this mean? This means that although white households have less impact per dollar spent, they spend more dollars than the Latin and Black households. So much so that aggregately, white households impact the environment more. And there are a lot of rationale and reasons behind that. And I want you to brainstorm on these complex relationships and come up with maybe 1 or 2 ways you would use this food consumption, race, ethnic information to change human behavior. Now, this isn't a poll. We just want to take a few minutes to break up this talk and spend about 3 minutes or so, write it in the chat, maybe on a piece of paper or even in your head, and just kind of keep it there, and we'll talk more about it during the Q&A. So we'll take a 3-minute break, and I'll come back and we'll start the conversation again. And we still have a few more minutes left, so feel free to, if you're finished with your answer, to you can stand up, move a little bit, because we'll get into science communication here after that. And it'll be very engaging and emotionally trying. So I'm looking, it seems like most folks are pretty close to finished. So I'll continue on, and if you need me to stop again, just let me know. But let's move over to some policy proposals we developed based on our findings. Well, first, we wanted to incorporate food consumption impact rates into SNAP education. Now, of course, for many of you, you may be aware that SNAP is equivalent to the food stamp program. We think that incorporating the broad findings at a qualitative level into SNAP education could be helpful if we do it across demographic groups. We also want to incentivize certain subgroups on a race and/or socioeconomic level through SNAP to purchase more fish and plant-based foods. And we came to that conclusion based on a myriad of previously done studies that support that sentiment of purchasing more fish and plant-based foods, and that having a positive impact on the environment as well as human health. And then lastly, we should use these demographically specific data points to support food access and health issues that are already identified in the USDA dietary guidelines. So we think we can further bolster the USDA dietary guidelines and maybe put a little more meat on the bones, pun intended, when it comes to addressing food access issues at a systemic level. So those are some broad approaches we came up with, and we'll talk more about some of your ideas during the Q&A. But let's move to science communication. Let me look at my time. All right, we're doing all right. So this gets real interesting. I kind of wish I was there in person. We would just riff with each other and I'd ask you some questions, but hopefully some of you have engaged science in different formats, maybe through TikTok. I just got onto TikTok, so I'm learning that there's actually a lot of good educational information out there. But Facebook, Twitter, all these other frameworks are science communication frameworks. Not only can you publish in Nature, you can also get your message out through other means. Now, if you are personally trying to develop a science communication strategy, I would strongly suggest that you take this framework, but you don't finalize it until you get your work accepted. So it's important to know what your work is going to be, what your quantitative or qualitative messaging is going to be before you try to move towards a science communication strategy. Now, this is a cute acronym that I put together. I'm not sure if someone else has done this before. I came up with this on my own, so I'll take credit for it for now. But this is the MAP strategy for science communication that I've taken pieces from, other conferences and other folks that I've seen do it well. Now, the first is M for message, and find your message. That's important. You want to establish that. A is for art. It's absolutely critical you develop some art. And then we'll talk more about each of these, of course. A press release, P for press release. Create one. You have to do it. Otherwise, major media outlets are likely not to pay much attention to you. P is for public. Find your public relations and/or often referred to as PR reps. That can be done freelance or a host of other areas. And then P for promotion. Engage smartly in promoting your work through whatever means you decide to. We'll spend a little more time on message because I think this is where some folks fall short in understanding how to do so. So you want to synthesize complex science information into a relatively simple or short sentence or phrase, excuse me. And I'm going to give you an example on how to do so. All right, so here's the conclusion for one of the papers that we had a lot of success getting out into the media. So if you start at the first sentence, effectively adapting to climate change involves overcoming social and ecological system barriers. Somebody's already asleep, right? The present study, I mean, nobody's really going to read that unless you're really, really interested into science. And the big part about messaging, of course, is to get non-science wonks to be interested in this. So first you want to highlight, hopefully in your conclusion section, which 2 or 3 points you potentially could synthesize into a more layman message. So I highlight that the US results indicate that white demographic yields such and such and such and such in one box. The other box, I identify study findings that suggest obtaining data with the intention of building consensus across climate change adaptation Well, all right, that could also be another message that I synthesize into something a little bit more tangible. And then the last point that I highlight is the findings facilitate the development of climate change adaptation policy. And I talk about the understanding phase of this climate change framework. And for the people really interested in research, they're going to love all of those points as is. However, I chose that first box and I synthesized it into this phrase. Scientific study finds that whites disproportionately impact the environment by food consumption practices. That's something almost anyone can understand for the most part. It's not quite an 8th grade reading level, but it's much more palatable than the way the conclusion section was written in the publication. So that's one example of taking a complex science message and distilling it. Now, let's move to the art section. You want to develop original pictures and/or video to represent your work, or use interesting royalty-free content. Sometimes you don't have to develop it. Not everyone has that skill set or knows someone that does, but you can purchase royalty-free content that works with whatever your study or your message is that you think will be appealing to a layman. And now, for me, for that specific study, this was my artwork that I took a little picture. Somebody had like mowed down a sick tree in front of my apartment, and I took a plate from my house and threw some food on it and took a picture. And it seemed to work out well, and it got used. So you can be innovative and not spend a lot of money in doing this. Of course, I had to do some video. So I, got some lighting, used one of my cameras. It did cost a little money to get the right lens, so I'll disclaim that. But I did a 1-minute video spot to help promote this message. So those are a few examples of artistic approaches you could take. You can also do graphic arts, memes, whatever you want to use to help message your product. Now, on the press release side, this is something that does take some honing of skills. It does take maybe some practice. I went to ComSci-Con. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of that group, but they focus on science communication. It is competitive to get into it. I think it started maybe in Australia. I know Harvard pushes that ComSci-Con a lot, but you want to create an interesting press release. And my suggestion, based on all the advice I've received, is to make this 250 words or less. Lesser the better if you can effectively communicate your message. You want it to be 2 or 3 paragraphs. You want to highlight content that would interest layman audiences. In connection to that, you want to consider targeting maybe 1 or 2 audience types. Are you targeting scientists that are outside of environmental engineering? Or maybe you're targeting anthropologists specifically. And if you're an anthropologist, you may know exactly what might appeal to an anthropologist. Those are the things you want to consider. So this is my actual draft press release for not the study that won the award, but the study that preceded that. And I've underlined the first, a really important part of the first paragraph. And it says, the study results are novel and statistically significant. So if, number one, you want to make sure that's scientifically true. But if you have strength in your paper that way, you want to make sure you articulate that. Even though you might be talking to someone who's not an expert in your area, they're smart people too, and they're going to want to know how strong your results are. And then the last sentence of this paragraph is, a story like this has real potential to have high impact, considering its relevance to popular topics such as climate change, racial equity, and human health. So within that first paragraph, you want to clearly get to your PR contacts. Maybe you're talking to an editor. You want to make sure you articulate why your paper not only is scientifically rigorous, but also can translate into high views or readership. Now, these are paragraphs 2 and 3. In paragraph 2, I went a little bit more into the science just to make sure that I back up the rigor of my claim. And in the last paragraph, I went through more implications about what the study could influence in regards to societal dynamics, in regards to political dynamics. Now, you might want to craft this message differently. If you're For instance, I think this one may have been to the Chicago Tribune. I don't remember for sure. But if you are targeting a more broadly frameworked media outlet, you might articulate your message differently. If, on the other hand, you're trying to get Popular Science or Scientific American to publish your work, you might go a little bit more into the details on the science side, since they target a different style of audience on your press release. Hopefully this is all helpful, but these are all the dynamics you do after you've done the really, really hard scientific work. Next, P for public. Find your PR rep. Now, sometimes this could be a PR group within the university. I know university structures are different. I don't know for sure how USF is structured, but sometimes there are PR folks already stationed in your university. You just have to know which one to talk to and which one would be interested in your topic. You could also reach out to freelancers. There are a bunch of folks out here who write for a living and are looking for really interesting scientific studies to publish in their various outlets. And then, of course, you have your normal news and media outlets. Try to communicate with the appropriate PR that covers your kind of work. I'll emphasize that again. Make sure you contact the right person. Sometimes you only get one shot to make a great impression, especially when you're young. I mean, I'm not even a faculty member, so I'm a postdoctoral research associate. So I have to make sure I establish my credibility early and maintain it. And you don't want to lose it once you get it, because sometimes you only get one shot to make a good impression with these folks. Another point to make, it is okay to communicate with many PR folks at first, unless, for instance, you're on an NSF fellowship or something like that. You want to make sure you work through their channels first, and you don't just jump out outside of your framework. If you're being funded, or you maybe work for a university, or you have a job affiliation, make sure you have those politics solidified before you reach out to other freelance PR folks. And do not violate your public relation person's trust once they show interest in your press release. So I don't know, maybe you send it out to 5 to 10 people. You finally got someone who says, yeah, I would like to take this press release and make it my own and push it out to the media. Once you get one of those responses, get clarification from them that, is it okay for me to work with other PR folks, or should I just work with you? Based on my experience, once you get someone on your team, just stick with that person and they'll do their best to get the message out, because you don't want different messaging happening with different PR folks. That can really frustrate a PR specialist. P for promotion. Engage in smart, ethical promotion of your work. Especially as a scientist, you want to make sure that ethics part is really solid. I made mention earlier, use social media and word of mouth tactics. At least that's what I did. Use select news and or media links to promote your work. You don't want to necessarily promote your work from certain media outlets, and there are a bunch of them these days who are just clickbait heavy. And know your promotion audience. So if I'm promoting on Facebook, I have a lot of family members. My mom is on Facebook, right? My grandmother, her family members, things of that sort. When I promote on Facebook, I might promote a little differently than I do on Instagram, which may be a picture and me sitting on the beach, and then I talk about climate change, right? So just know and think about which audiences you're trying to appeal to, and do not get too political unless you intend to on purpose. And definitely don't do so without fully understanding the potential consequences for not only you, your family, but your work affiliations. So once you go down a political lane with a message that even could be perceived as political, even though your results may not necessarily be political, understand those implications. Be thinking about them, because they will come back if this thing gets picked up by media outlets. And this is maybe the most important part: be emotionally and professionally prepared for the things that popularity and attention brings. There's no better teacher than experience. But if you end up getting picked up by major news outlets, which can happen if your study is interesting enough, you might even want to prepare close family members and or friends if they could be impacted. And I'll describe a little bit on why that's the case. And Heather, we're still doing okay on time? Okay. Certain media outlets can and will portray your content as they see fit, and it will not necessarily be an accurate depiction of your work. That's okay. You can't control every media outlet's response to your work and how they portray it, how they headline it. What you do want to do is make sure that anytime it comes back to you, you correct the inconsistencies, you make sure you stay steady in your messaging. And what I did, and I got an advice from an editor from the journal we published this one in, and he told me to develop an FAQ on my personal website. And I can assure you, once some attention started to really come, that really, really helped. I was able to just say, okay, media person or group of folks that are asking questions, farmers were asking me questions and drilling me. Let me put this FAQ up. And it has a farmer section where I talk about the areas and who we incorporated into our analyses and our study, and what kind of sensitivities did we incorporate into our framework. You can do all of that one time and just copy and paste the link. And that comes in handy so you don't waste your time running after every single question and worrying about the political implications. So that's the MAP strategy. Hopefully it was appealing. You are the first audience I've ever presented this to. I apologize if I stumbled a bit. I'm still refining this message, but hopefully it was helpful. Take as much as you want and utilize it for your own study. And if you do, and you get as lucky as I've been, you can get into some major media outlets. You know, these are representations of some of the outlets I've been able to be quoted in and have my studies advertised in. All that being said, as I mentioned earlier, with that kind of attention, you also get some of this. And you need to be ready if you're going to be engaging in the social media sphere. And this is just one small snapshot of the backlash and the trolling that happens for even scientific studies. Some of these dynamics actually had manifest into threats, and some of these are ongoing today. So you do need to be emotionally prepared. If you have an interesting and salacious study that's based in scientific rigor, some folks are going to come for you. Smart, maybe not so smart, scientists, non-scientists. So be emotionally prepared for what those implications are. And with that, I really appreciate your time. I didn't want to make it too long and laborious, but hopefully this was informative, and I'm very excited to answer some questions. I'll leave this up just for a little longer, just in case you want to follow me on Twitter, IG, or go to the website. You can sign up for a newsletter there. And of course, you can reach out to me personally via email. But I really appreciate your time and your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bozeman. That was very insightful. And yeah, we will go ahead and charge through the questions. We've got about 20 or so minutes. So we have a lot of questions coming in. So in the chat, let's see, I don't see in the Q&A. Again, if you see the Q&A button, you can submit your question there, or you can join the conversation in the chat and submit your question. So when you first asked us to engage in the chat, let's see. So there was a question about what are the implications of these findings for the ways race/ethnicity may relate to specific patterns of food consumption?
Yeah, so specifically, for instance, we think one of the reasons behind the Latinx group having the highest food consumption impact rate is the increased consumption of snacks and environmentally intense foods that not only damage human health, but also have, per kilogram of food consumed, more impact on food production. So for instance, if you're eating candy bars and chips more often than locally grown strawberries, for instance, not only are you going to have less than ideal human health outcomes, you're also going to impact land greenhouse gas and water dynamics at a higher rate per dollar spent than you would otherwise, right? So those were some of the finding implications that help bolster the results that I talked about in regard to our socioeconomic study. Hopefully that was insightful. We also see that same pattern emerge in Black households too. And why is that the case, right? Well, think about that food expenditure slide that I had put up in the middle of the presentation. Well, when we think about that, the Black and Latinx demographics tend to have less money to spend overall. On top of that, they spend more money, especially the Latinx subgroup, spends more of their income on food. And if you have to feed a decent amount of folks and you have less money to do it with, what are you going to do? You're going to find value, and you're not necessarily going to prioritize healthy food items if they cost more. And that's where that food access issue comes into play when it comes to developing policy proposals and things around that. Now, I don't want to harp on this issue too long so I can get to other questions, but hopefully I was able to add some meat onto that framework.
Yes, thank you. And actually a follow-up question to that, the next question was, why change human behavior? What could be changed about the food accessibility, and how would human behavior respond to that availability?
I really do think we have to, at least this is what I've come up with so far, in a high income country like the US, where taxes and subsidies tend to work well. And I do have to disclaim, if we're applying these same approaches to developing countries that may not necessarily have an economic structure established, these findings don't work. But in the US, where we're high income, we can shift subsidies and taxes and change behavior. So we are simply going to have to subsidize certain kinds of foods in specific kinds of communities. I know it sounds weird to be that granular with our approach, but I think we have to approach subsidies and taxes in that way to begin to shift our behavior. And once the behavior shifts over a long period of time, it becomes a habit ingrained in generational cultural norms. And then we can start seeing maybe the Black and Latinx group purchase affordable food in stores that they can actually get to as a norm. But it's going to take a lot of years and a lot of federal government and state level engagement to be able to get to that point, in my opinion.
Thank you so much for that. And sort of a follow-up to that too is, so do you think that the rise in community and home gardens in Black and Latinx population can shift the current fuse impacts found through your research?
The answer to that is yes, but not for the reasons you think. It will shift behavior if it's done at a mass enough scale, a critical mass, so to speak. But it won't necessarily shift food, energy, water impacts at a level that we really want to see it by itself. I think what I like to call food social enterprises, where you have these small gardens, maybe even nonprofit or for-profit groups engaged in education activities and actually growing some of their own food items. Yeah, we'll see a very minute decrease around the edges when it comes to food, energy, water impacts, but the real impact are the social implications, where those kids are now seeing food grown consistently. And then we might start seeing generational impact on communities and familiarity with healthy food. And that's when you start spending money in the grocery stores and demanding change at the economic level. And once we get to the food distribution and marketing dynamic, that's when we're going to see large enough changes at the food, energy, water level to maybe curb some of the worst effects of climate change over the coming years. So the answer to that is yes, but maybe not for just having a garden in your backyard. It's going to take that and the social implications that we're trying to see long term.
Thank you. Yes, and you mentioned the emerging leaders. So one question was then, how can we utilize the, say like the K through 12 educational system to take on the role of fostering awareness among emerging leaders to improve climate change adaptation and policy?
Yes, and I don't know if any of you have checked out my profile. For as long as I can remember, I've tried to engage K through 12. And I do think changing hearts and minds, the earlier is the better. I think we've seen that represented in a lot of social movements here these days. So I do think we have to target there, especially at the collegiate level. If, you know, for instance, I'm an aspiring faculty member. So one of the things that I propose in any talk that I have is staying engaged at the K through 12 level so we can develop leaders and just normal workers and decision makers to think about social implications when they make decisions and not profit and immediate gains by themselves. We can do both at the same time, in my opinion. So that is an area we have to focus on. I personally try to jump at the opportunities to speak with K through 12 just as much as I do for moments like this. And then that's not to say that all of you as fellows can't make significant change. It's just we're going to have to do both, in my opinion, to make the holistic change that we desperately need.
Yes, great. Yes, all of you fellows could be role models. And then, so yeah, so speaking of just, doing everything at once, so how do you balance all of this and conduct the science?
Well, I try to get good sleep and I play PlayStation as a, as a relaxation. And quite frankly, I also do some music as outlet. And that's another thing I want to say, because I'm looking at a relatively diverse group here. If you have other passions in your life, you don't have to drop your passions to do science. You do have to prioritize science because it does take a lot of time to hone the skill, but keep those other passions intact for therapy. You don't have to, for instance, if I used to rap and I still do music production, I make sure I say those things and I don't shun away from them. Of course, they don't take precedence over my life, but you don't have to give up yourself to do science. Science should accept you as you are. You do have to subscribe to the rigor of science, but you can still keep yourself intact because we need healthy people engaged in science too, because we need healthy solutions and we also need healthy long-term implications, and unhealthy people can't produce those things most likely over the long term.
I think the fellows and those in the panelist section can unmute yourselves and ask your questions. If you wanted. Joe, can you discuss the institutional support that you got to do the science communication and that, to even lead you down that route? Did you have to seek it yourself, or was there a, formalized set of things that you got as you went through the PhD? Thanks for the seminar also, it was great.
Thank you, Maya. And really great question. I've never been asked that before, but I'm really glad you asked. Both. So first, and I didn't make mention of this, but it is so important that you find an advisor that will support your work. You do not want to be battling with your advisor as you pursue a master's or a PhD or whatever it is your goal. So I had an advisor that, he didn't share my skin tone, but he shared my passion for equity. And that's important to establish first. So I spent a lot of time on interviews and reading up profiles and trying to find a good fit for my personality type. And to be honest, he found me. So sometimes you look really hard and, you don't find someone that seems like it's a good fit and it falls right into your lap. So just stay persistent. And I've spent many, many years before I found the right advisor to settle with. So that's one. Secondly, I did do a lot of research on my own. I did get clearance from my advisor, of course, but it's different when you go to your advisor with, hey, here's my press release and my strategic plan. Do you approve? Rather than, hey, I want to get my work in popular science. How do I do that? So you want to make sure that you've done enough work before you come to your advisor so that you not only earn their respect, but you can kind of include them in your strategy. And then your advisor is going to say, hey, for instance, one thing that happened was Rush Limbaugh did a radio spot on me. And he said some outlandish things. I don't know if many of you know who Rush Limbaugh is, but a political talking head that's on the far right. And then in a Medium response to an article, some reporter got with me and I made mention of that, and I didn't quite attack him back, but I kind of got into the political fray. And one thing my advisor said is, hey, be careful of that. You might go too far down that line. And then next thing you know, your science is more so a political tool rather than the actual work that we put behind this. So you want to keep your advisor involved and find good mentors that are going to, go down this path with you. And all of it's new. This research is novel, and a lot of the research you're going to do is going to be new. So you want to have somebody who's ready to take risks. I happen to have a really, really well-established advisor, So it worked out. He wasn't as worried about some of his own politics as maybe a brand new faculty member is, but you want to think about all those things as you approach your science. Hopefully, Maya, that was a, good enough response.
Great. Yeah.
Any other questions? Don't be shy.
Colleen, you had quite a bit of questions.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I don't want to like take up the space in the room. I know there's a lot of great fellows or Strong Coast fellows to ask questions. Yeah, I'm Colleen Naughton. I'm an assistant professor at UC Merced. I do a lot of LCA work, so I had more nitty gritty like life cycle assessment questions. I know there's others on the call also that do LCA, so not the only one, just about like kind of functional units, what kind of software you're using, SimaPro, and like your major data sources. Just interested. I know I should read, I've like gone over some of the papers. I can read more in depth, but.
No, I can give you real quick. A gold mine for food consumption impact information is the Berea Center for Food and Nutrition. So BARILLA. That is a underlooked conglomerate of information that they actually pull information from other scientific studies, synthesize it into consistent functional units, and you can apply it to your own LCA model if you approach it that way. Open LCA, which is probably more commonly known, you can use the USDA. It kind of changes here and there in ways that I like more than others, but you can use their database, centralized database, and just Google it. And they actually have some data on various food items that you can import into your models too. I didn't use a standalone LCA framework to collect my data because it just came from so many different data sources. I had to just kind of go old school and manually take various units and uniformly apply them. And then you also want to, from a methodological standpoint, Colleen, you probably will appreciate this. You want to make sure that if you use scientific literature, which I also use too, make sure that the methodological approach, for instance, in my case, it was cradle to farm gate, applies across every data point you pull into your study, because that's going to be rigorously assessed if you have good peer reviewers. And trust me, most of them are really good. So you want to make sure to, if you're using a bunch of data sets, which we often have to do in LCA, right? Because it's a burgeoning field. It's not necessarily new, but the data is new. And you're just going to have to pull it from wherever you can find it. And then use another important piece is use your statistical analytical approaches to bolster whatever claims you're making across your LCA. So I use minimum and maximum numbers, and I use means as an approach, but I statistically analyzed the food consumption part to create confidence in my food consumption impact outputs. So you want to try to have some kind of statistical measure, either a sensitivity analysis or statistical significance using ANOVAs or t-tests to try to bolster whatever claims you're making. Otherwise, don't publish it. Wait and talk to an advisor or something like that, and get your model to the next phase.
Thank you. Great presentation. I haven't used Open LCA as much yet, but I'm hoping I can use that. SimaPro is very expensive, so.
It is.
I see Yoel has a question. You could unmute yourself.
Yes, I had a question about the potential pushback from the meat industry on some of the interventions like SNAP awareness campaigns and fused nutrition labeling.
Yeah.
Do you think that's an issue? And if it is, how would you think that could be overcome?
Well, I can't, it's not like the meat industry emailed me and say, hey, I'm the meat industry, this is how I feel about your work. However, I did get some scientific pushback for folks who tend to publish by getting funds from the meat and dairy industry. So you can kind of make the connection. Essentially, you just have to use your scientific merits to push them off. Now, I actually had some well-established scientists, I think maybe one was an associate professor, maybe one was even a full professor, emailed the editorial staff for the journal and say, oh, this paper has to get pulled, and here are these arguments. And it's kind of like a post-published peer review session. But as long as you have done your homework and you have good mentorship, and I would strongly suggest bringing in someone who's outside of your immediate engineering field to, kind of help develop your arguments. Just have your arguments down. And that's where my FAQ came about, where it's like, hey, meat industry, hey, farmers, hey, social person who's mad about the fact that I'm highlighting these data sets across racial and ethnic subgroups. Why is that important? You have your answers already established. So you will get pushback, especially if it gets picked up by major news outlets. And so the answer is yes, I think so. And so what is science?
Thank you.
We have about 3 minutes left. Anyone else want to chime in with their question? We still have a lot of questions left in the chat.
Look like Michelle raised her hand.
Okay, Michelle, go ahead.
Hi. So I just want to say I really loved your presentation. I thought the results were really interesting. And I was like, okay, well, now I have to read the paper. But I really like how you demonstrated all of your social media, how you present the information. So I kind of have two questions. So how do you separate, because you mentioned that you rap, and I asked him, can we hear a bar, but you don't have.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
If you Google hard enough.
Okay.
I find something.
But like, do you separate like your personal life from your like, if I go to your Twitter, is it just your academic Twitter, or is it like both combined? And then secondly, you mentioned Snap, but how does the Snap correlate to what you mentioned? Because it seemed like some of your results were related to it, like the short and sweet was that white people have a larger environmental impact in certain areas.
Right.
So I just didn't get that connection between how that connected to Snap.
And I didn't explain it well. So let me go to that second part first. On the SNAP education, the reason why we chose SNAP as a framework is because, number one, it's federally run, and they already have race and ethnic information on the people who utilize food stamps. So it's a perfect group that we could find willing participants to engage in educating them about what their ethnic subgroup tends to do when they purchase food, right? So let's say I've been on food stamps before. So when I was on food stamps back in my early years in college, if someone would have came to me and said, hey, would you like this 30-minute educational opportunity to show you how to best spend your food stamp dollars, I may have said yes, and then I would have learned something, and maybe I would have made better choices on what I could spend my food stamps on. So that's an example on the SNAP side. When it comes to social media, at first I was super, super scared. And I was like, and to be honest, I was even scared starting my PhD. I'm like, oh my gosh, well, I come from the inner city, and, I didn't have a perfect life. So should I hide all of these things? And eventually I just said, nah, and, I'm just going to be what I am, and I'm going to let my science speak for itself. However, I'm not going to purposely highlight the worst parts of my younger years. But most folks in the profession, especially in the academic world, they've come from eclectic backgrounds. Some of them were artists before they turned into scientists and vice versa. If you find your people, they'll accept you as long as you are scientifically on point. So you just got to make sure you are on point with your work, and they'll be much more willing to accept the other parts.
Thank you.
Hopefully that helps. So if you go to my Twitter, you'll see some hints of music, but you'll mostly see academic things. Instagram, you might see a little bit more both, right? And you'll see my associations with other artists that I'm working with. But I actually think music is going to be critically important in getting some of these messages out from an educational standpoint. So I make a scientific argument that it's important for me to stay connected to the artistic world. So those are the kind of ways you can incorporate all parts of yourself into the scientific sphere.
Thank you.
So do you have a bar? Do you want to share a bar?
Oh, share a bar? No, you gotta go straight.
Okay. Okay, well.
I see we're at 3, but I see that Janiqua Howard, I think that's who it is, wants to ask a question. Just a follow-up on that communication part, which I think you may have answered. But she's also in Chicago and got her PhD from our group.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, but yeah, you know what? Thank you, Joe, for this presentation. It was definitely great. So I did have a quick question. So I work a lot with population with 2 or more chronic health conditions. And so one of the things that we do is behavioral modification. Behavioral modification is extremely important because we're trying to, alleviate all these chronic health conditions. But it is critical. I see that you had a theory of MAP. How can we utilize something like this? Because again, behavioral modification from that particular group is very complex.
Yeah. So first, I mean, we could talk offline for sure. And I can get you connected with some of the social scientists that I collaborate with who essentially help develop this for me. So that's the short and sweet answer. I won't go into too much detail of the many complex directions we could go, but in essence, I think we're going to have to step away from the negative messaging framework and figure out how to use positive messaging on getting climate change adaptation behaviors to line up with what we need them to line up with. And I kind of broadly talk about climate change adaptation, even as it relates to the food, energy, water nexus. Not everyone likes to do that, but I tend to do that. So it could be a picture of a nice apple instead of a hamburger with a red line down the middle, which is the example I like to push up. We want the nice apple that attracts people rather than don't eat hamburgers. Obviously, that doesn't work politically. I don't think it works socially. And based on the research I've seen so far, it tends not to change behavior. So that's just one example of how we could utilize the MAP framework to get a message across. And sometimes you want to be negative on purpose to rile up and then have a strategy on how to take the attention you get and push it towards a positive direction. So there's a lot of different ways you can go strategically when it comes to SciComm.
Joe, we'll definitely be talking offline.
All right. You got my email, so hopefully just reach out to me. I'm accessible.
Okay, I'm hearing you.
All right. Hey, you're in Chicago too, so I'm in Pilsen, so we can link up also.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Great. Oh, go ahead.
Questions, right? I know we're past 3 o'clock, so. But did anyone, we could have Dr. Bozeman for like a few more minutes. Did anyone have a burning question that they wanted to ask? I know you went from the top of the chat, Heather. I think I went from the bottom. So I'm not sure where in the middle we lost.
Yeah, I'm just looking to pull out, that's exactly what I was doing, pull out some in the middle. So.
We don't have to.
I mean, I have a question if we want one more.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Lyndon. I was noticing, or like I've had some experience. I'm actually from Arkansas, and we have a lot of food insecurity there. And one of the big issues is that there's like miles and miles and miles of agricultural land, but then the only places to get food are like convenience stores. And so I guess I was thinking, even if with SNAP education, like if people just don't have access to food, then it's not very helpful. I guess I was just wondering, like, did you think about food deserts at all in the work, and just thoughts that you have on addressing that issue?
Absolutely. And Lyndon, I think that's what your name is written as here.
Yes.
I really appreciate the question. Very, very quick story. I'm from Ohio originally, and Dayton, Ohio. And one of the things I used to do with my parents, my mom in particular, is drive down the street to the farm and go buy some corn from the farmer down the road. And now if I drive back to that same farm, it's not always growing corn, but it definitely can't buy anything from that farmer anymore.
Yeah.
And that's the food distribution system changing under our feet before we even realize it's changed. Even when the food is around the corner, you can't access it. And so we're really going to have to, I think, simplify the food market system and stop creating these barriers to falsely create demand where it really doesn't exist. And that's where we get to Yoel's, and forgive me if I pronounce your name wrong. That's where we get to his point about, the meat industry and the dairy industry. There are a lot of very, very powerful institutions that want to create demand where it doesn't practically exist. And that's the art of capitalism, right?
Yes.
So we're going to have to balance making money with facilitating access. Why? Because we're going to have 10 billion people roughly here in 2050. We can't play any more games. And then I think we all see the climate change dynamic. So we're just going to have to step it up, change the way we approach things, change our priorities. And I'm completely with you when it comes to the absurdity of having farmland and no food.
Yeah. Thank you.
No problem.
Also, I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm really glad I tuned in.
Thank you, Lyndon. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Joe. Heather, you had something to close off with?
Sure. Well, yeah, I just wanted to say, thank you so much on behalf of Strong Coasts. And, thank you for sharing your perspective on this. So for those that are interested, we also have other webinars coming up. Be sure to sign up for them. You can find them on our website at www.strongcoast.org. And we will be uploading this webinar to our website. We were streaming live, and so you'll also find it on our YouTube channel. So be on the lookout for those, for an email with those links. And that's it. So we wish you all happy days ahead. And thank you so much for joining us.
Have a good one, y'all. See you later.
Bozeman. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr.
Thank you.
Bozeman.
Have a great
Thank
day.
you so much.
Thank you.